Hello and welcome back to my channel, The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. Well, today, finally, we are getting a work by Debussy on this channel. Actually, a while back, one of my most loyal subscribers, the composer slash organist slash pianist, Graham Twist, asked me when I would get around to finally doing a Debussy recording. So here it is finally, Graham. I hope it's worth the wait. This piece is, of course, one of the most iconic of Debussy's works. In many ways, it's kind of a poster child for all of Debussy's most well-known compositional techniques. There's prominent chordal planing, in which chords, oftentimes with prominent fifths, are moved in parallel motion with no consideration for standard classical voice leading. The use of expansive, suspended textures covering the whole expanse of the keyboard and irresistibly suggesting the Javanese gamelan. The delicate suggestions of unusual scales and modes, usually drawn from the so-called church modes. Particularly prominent in this piece are the Mixolydian and the Dorian modes, for example. Of course, the image of this piece, which is based on the legend of the Cathedral of Ys, which would emerge from the ocean into the daylight and then disappear again beneath the waves, is so clearly delineated in the music that I don't think I really need to say too much about that. I do think that there is an element about this music, though, that is usually not appreciated fully, and that's the striking nature of the form. In the performance, you'll notice that I call this piece a ternary form, an ABA form, which is a pretty standard form found throughout musical history. But in this case, it's really only an approximation. More accurate would be to say that it's kind of in an arch shape, but even that doesn't quite tell the whole story. I think the key to this is that there's really no suggestion of the typically Germanic approach to exposing his melodic material. So there's no clear statement of a first theme, for example. Instead, Debussy sets an atmosphere at the beginning and only suggests the outline of his complete A theme. As a corollary to that, we don't start in the tonic key of C major. Instead, we start with a G in the bass. This could be seen as the dominant of C in common tonal practice, but it doesn't really behave that way. Instead, it feels much more like we're in some kind of a modal situation. Maybe we're in Mixolydian mode on G. There's really only one place in this piece, at the climax of the first A section, where Debussy even slightly seems to reference standard dominant tonic tonality, that kind of tonal duality of dominant and tonic, right at the moment where we can imagine that the cathedral has come into the full light of day. At any rate, after this opening suggestion of the main theme, we get a sudden contrast. We get a different idea with a very different kind of tonal outline. And again, this idea is going to be developed fully in the so-called B section. So the germ of the two main ideas is right there at the beginning, but not fully developed, not fully worked out yet. Then gradually the first idea takes over again and begins to take form over a really striking set of harmonic developments. This approach to writing was Debussy's revolution against standard classical forms, which he thought had been used for far too long, unthinkingly by many adherents to tradition. As time went on, Debussy more and more objected to using these standard forms, the sonata, the symphony, for example. Even when he did finally get around to writing some sonatas, like the violin sonata or the cello sonata, late in his life, he took an extraordinarily idiosyncratic approach to constructing these pieces. His approach to these forms was not much similar to the kind of pristine neoclassicist manner of his younger contemporary, Maurice Ravel. Despite how much they're usually thrown together in casual conversation, they actually had very different compositional methods. Obviously, they shared much in common in their kind of generally understated, subtle aesthetic and their use of harmony, but they really went in totally different directions as their careers progressed when it came to form and content. At this point in Debussy's career, around 1909 or 1910, there's still a kind of classicism to the way that he uses these very exotic materials for the time. The design is very simple, it's very clear, it's very well proportioned, even though it doesn't quite follow a textbook form. In the second book of Preludes, on the other hand, written just a couple of years later, he had already progressed much farther along his trajectory of organically conceived forms, which, though they may at first seem to be highly improvised, they're in fact very logically and beautifully constructed, but constructed in such a way as to hide their structural seams rather than to draw attention to them, as was the case with classical composers. There are several details to be aware of when playing this piece. Since this is one of the most popular amongst Debussy's works, I feel I should mention some performance advice. In the score, you'll notice that Debussy marks for a time signature 6/4 and then 3/2. So both 6 quarter notes to a bar and 3 half notes to a bar. Well, that's may seem obvious, it's the same thing, but it actually becomes important. If you listen to Debussy's piano roll of this piece, he made a piano roll of it, it becomes obvious that he actually intended this to mean that the performer should modulate the tempo at several points. So specifically it measures 6, 12, 21, and then again at the very end of the piece. So what do I mean by modulate the tempo? It's a little bit of an obscure term. I simply mean that at certain points you should play twice as fast or twice as slow, so that the beat stays the same, but it corresponds sometimes to a half note and sometimes to a quarter note, as the case may be. I don't know why Debussy did not mark this into the score more explicitly. It would have been very easy to do. Perhaps it was an error of the engraver that was never corrected. I don't know. But it's fairly certain from Debussy's own performance what he had in mind with that time signature. It's unfortunate that it didn't make it into the score, because now we have a whole history of performances of this piece with large sections of it in basically the wrong tempo, and it's extremely difficult to play if you take it literally and don't modulate the tempo in this way at certain places. The sections that are largely in half notes become practically impossible to sustain if you take even close to a broad enough tempo at the opening. So anyway, please enjoy this performance of this beautiful piece. I'll have another prelude for you next week. This is going to be a 2-part series, and next week I'm going to have one from Book 2, in which we can clearly see the development of Debussy's organic compositional style in action. So until then, please enjoy the performance of the Sunken Cathedral.